Thank you. Thank you very much, Elif. I thank you very much for making this occasion possible, for inviting me here. I also have to thank at the outset Hussein Erpehlivan, whom I have not met, but who very graciously provided me with some of the images I'm going to be making use of and published them as well. And I also have to extend thanks to Erdem Görek, a man of Istanbul who helped us in our travels in a way that made this visit to Ankara possible. So thanks to all. So I imagine that almost all of you in your visits to museums of classical antiquity here in Turkey, in Greece, anywhere in the world where there are collections of classical antiquities, have encountered versions of what has come to be called the Totenmahl relief, relief scenes that are often associated with funerary monuments, but they are also identified or associated as votive monuments. Are they something that is funereal in purpose, or are they religious and devotional? There is evidence that points in both directions. So in Anatolia, the great majority of these reliefs, especially common in the Hellenistic and Roman period, are clearly identified as funerary monuments. They have the names of the deceased. We have Dionysiodoros, the son of Syros, or Matrodoros, the son of Caligeton. But they all bear this variations of this common type: a reclining, banqueting male, a prominent seated female next to him, and then with attendants on either side. And some of these reliefs, some of these funerary reliefs also include an interesting detail. So here's another Anatolian relief in the Istanbul Museum. Hephaestion, the son of Papas, is identified as a hero. So these also, while being funerary, identify the deceased as, in some sense, a semi-divine hero, or indicate that this funerary monument is a place of worship. And we often wonder, here is Hephaestion. We don't know whether that's his dad, Papas, or a brother or somebody, but obviously he was a blacksmith, true to his name there. But then there are many of these reliefs, and often without any dedicatory inscription, that have the same formula: a reclining male banqueting next to a seated female with attendants, but they bear the hallmarks, the indications that this is a votive or sacred scene where the deceased is indicated by the presence of a serpent, eating from the table as a kind of an underworld feature, and often as diminutive figures, as we see here on this relief on the left, votaries, worshippers who approach the couple on the couch. And in some cases, here, a relief that's in the Nie Carlsberg Museum in Copenhagen, we have a rare example with a very full inscription on it. First of all, the visiting votaries, the three small figures on the left, are identified by name. It's Aristomache, Theoris, and Olympiodoros. And then the inscription specifies that this is a dedication to friendly Zeus of perfect outcomes. I'm sorry, the inscription is cut off there, but it is Dei epitelios filios. And epitelios I translated as of perfect outcomes, but you may know in Greek that telos means ends. It also means death. It also means completion of life. So it's an underworld Zeus figure who is also a dedication to the mother of the god, the mother of the gods, but the mother of presumably Zeus of perfect outcomes, and to Agathe Tuke, or Tuke Agathe, the wife of the god. And so presumably this is on the right, Agathe Tuke seated on the couch next to Zeus Epitelios, with the votaries approaching, and again, an attendant who is serving wine to the divine couple. So what are these, or is there a common origin? Of course, the scholarship on this is fairly large, describing those that are clearly votive in nature, but also speculating about what the symbolism of these banqueting scenes are. Do they indicate a banquet of the deceased, indicating their status as elite individuals with servants and attendants? Is it a replica of a funerary meal honoring the dead, or is it an imagined scene of the dead in the underworld dining from the offerings made by their living relatives? All of those are possibilities that have been suggested. I will suggest here that this series of banqueting scenes and related scenes that we'll see are associated with them in some of the earliest versions of these reliefs can be understood and explained in the context of a story that Herodotus tells about the death of a prince, that is Atys, the son of Croesus, in a way that helps elucidate and I hope also clarifies the link between the semi-divine or heroic aspect of these reliefs and also the funerary aspect. So let's take a look at the evidence for these in the earliest form. They appear primarily in a series of votive stelae, or funerary stelae, I should say, that are found in the vicinity of Daskylion, the satrapal capital of the Persian Empire, and they date from as early as the end of the 6th or beginning of the 5th century, right through the end of the 5th century and probably into the early 4th century. In other words, the existing monuments are all Achaemenid period monuments, but they concentrate in the area of the northwestern Anatolia. And they have, and here are a couple of additional examples that come from the same area, a formulaic set of scenes. There is the Totenmahl or banqueting scene that is regularly a part of these reliefs, the most common element. But there are also procession scenes with a wheeled cart and people in procession. And there are also found commonly with them hunting scenes. And as we'll see in a moment, also alternating with and sometimes accompanying them, battle scenes. So these three scenes are typical of the earliest examples of these, and we can expand those examples by bringing in a number of these reliefs that have been found on the frontiers of Bithynia and Phrygia, as well as in central Phrygia and in Lydia as well. And so I show here a number of these reliefs that have been found in the Bithynian Phrygian region in a style that Hussein Erplevan, who has published these, describes as a rural style. They are very definitely stylistically more regional in character than those that have been described as Greco-Persian. I don't know whether the Greek part is really legitimate, and we'll even question whether the Persian part is legitimate, but they are, whatever ethnicity you want to associate with them, they are Anatolian, and they are distinctive from the earliest 5th century of this part of Anatolia. And it bears saying a number of them do have inscriptions on them that identify the deceased, sometimes giving their names. And it's interesting that the inscriptions are in Aramaic, in Phrygian, in Lydian, and in Greek. So they are multi-ethnic, but whatever the language or ethnicity you want to attach to it, it is a regional style distinctive of what I would point out also is basically the heartland of the former Lydian kingdom. So let's look at and consider the meaning of the most common scene, the banqueting scene. Again, is this a banquet in the underworld? Is this a display of elite status? So what are some of the commonest elements? So first of all, of course, it is the reclining male and either a woman sitting either on the couch with the reclining male or on a stool or chair next to the reclining male. They are exchanging objects. In some cases, they look like an egg or a flower, but often drinking bowls or drinking cups are part of the accoutrements. They are regularly, universally accompanied by wine stewards. There are tripods or tables with amphoras, and the wine steward has a pitcher or a cup that he is presenting drinks to the reclining couple. In several cases, there are musicians that accompany the reclining couple, providing atmospheric music. And in a few cases, there's also a fan bearer who is fanning the occasion and providing a cool and refreshing breeze. Here, I highlight some of the best preserved of these reliefs, and I like to suggest that these represent wedding scenes. They are not inherently funereal. They do represent something of the status of the deceased, but they are emphasizing the marriage of the deceased. The woman and the man are of equal status, just as in the later funerary reliefs, and I'll point out the later funerary reliefs regularly identify and name the man. A woman who is of equal status in those reliefs is almost never named. So the man is the privileged focus of this, but his relationship with a distinctive female is an important part of this. And as I suggest, I think these are best understood as wedding scenes. Now, accompanying the wedding scenes very commonly are combat or hunting scenes. Most often hunting scenes. A horse rider is regularly part of this, and sometimes combat scenes, and as you can see in one of these reliefs, both a hunting and a combat scene. And you may be familiar with this motif in Achaemenid period monuments. Of course, among the Achaemenid Persians, Herodotus and other sources tell us that horse riding and hunting was a distinction of noble status. And you may be familiar with the Chan sarcophagus from the Troad, which displays both hunting and combat scenes of a horse-riding Persian nobleman. In that case, there are no other scenes accompanying that. The other sides of the sarcophagus are blank. And then there are the procession scenes, and these have been debated as to exactly what they signify. We have these wheeled carts in procession, and in the upper right, the scene that I show there is a fragment that shows a line of musicians in procession. Now, there have been debates about what these represent, but I think they are funerary biers. They are funerary carts. This is perhaps best evidenced by a detail on the top of the so-called mourning women's sarcophagus in the Istanbul Museum, the sarcophagus from Sidon of the end of the 5th, early 4th century, which shows the very same sort of covered cart with a series of men. And notice the one in the middle, actually both of the standing men have torn garments. They have their garments disheveled. They are clearly represented in a mourning status. So this is a funerary procession. So what do we have here? We have a series of formulaic reliefs in different styles, but all corresponding to the same formula: a marriage scene, a hunting scene or combat, and a funeral. And they are, of course, funerary monuments. This, I suggest, is illuminated by the story that Herodotus tells about the death of Atys, the son of Croesus, in his narrative about Croesus and his ill-fated plan to make war on Cyrus of Persia. Before Herodotus tells that story, he tells a story which, in a sense, foreshadows the ill fate in store for Croesus, but it otherwise has no direct bearing on the rise to power or the ambitions of Croesus. But he describes how Croesus had a favored son by the name of Atys, who was respected by all and expected to be the successor to Croesus. But Croesus had a dream. And in the dream, he was warned that his son would die by the point of an iron spear. And so in order to preserve his son, Croesus arranged to detain him in a marriage. To keep him apart from martial affairs. And so Atys is engaged in a wedding. And while this wedding is going on, then Croesus says, a series of men come from Mysia, from the far reaches of the Lydian kingdom, to report that a giant boar has been ravaging their lands, and would he please send his son and a hunting party to hunt this boar and save them from their woes. And Croesus says, no, I will not send my son, but I will send a hunting party nevertheless. Atys, who overhears this from his wedding procedures, complains, "Why, Father, are you not sending me out? A hunt is where a man earns honor. What will my wife think of me if I don't go out and hunt? What will the people of Lydia think of me if I don't prove myself as I have before as a leader of men in battle?" And so Croesus tells him, "Well, I had this awful dream that you would die by the point of a spear." Atys says, "Well, Dad, what spear does a boar have? There's surely no problem with that." And so Croesus says, "Well, fine, okay, I agree, you can go out on the hunt." And he sends a companion to protect his son and make sure that he is safe and sound. So Atys goes out on the hunt. But of course, in the course of the hunt, his protective companion misses the boar, but strikes Atys. Atys dies by the point of a spear. And then his body is brought home, and a funeral is held for Atys. And we're told that the companion who was sent, a Phrygian, as it happens, a Phrygian royal of royal ancestry, is so distraught over his hand in this affair that he commits suicide on the grave of Atys. And then Herodotus tells us that Croesus mourns Atys for 2 years, after which he decides, consulting the oracle at Delphi, whether he should make war on Cyrus. So the death of Atys and the funeral of Atys involved 2 years of mourning for Croesus and his kingdom, ample time to prepare a funerary monument. And in fact, if one consults, of course, the archaeology of Sardis, if you're familiar with Bin Tepe, the field of tumuli outside of Sardis, which includes the great tumulus of Atys, you know that there are many grave monuments there. The second largest of them, the Karanyarık Tepe tumulus, has been identified by Christopher Rattay as likely the tomb of Atys. It has masonry that fits the lifetime or the reign of Croesus. Now, there is no stele of Atys. No stele from the Lydian period survives with these scenes on it. But was there perhaps a stele that I would suggest could be the prototype for this wedding, hunt, and funeral theme? There is a hint given to us, perhaps more than a hint, in a fragment of the Ionic poet Hipponax of Ephesus, who writes in a dialect that is laced with Lydian words. And this is a passage which I provide one translation here. It's a passage with many unique words that people have speculated about their meaning and tried to amend them into something. But he is describing a traveling through the land of Lydia on the way to Smyrna, passing the tomb of Atys, the monument of Gyges, and the stele and memorial of Tos, if you read the text as it's given, Sultan of Mulatis. Now, the word translated as sultan is a Greek translation of Palmidos, which is the Greek for the Lydian word for a king, having turned your belly toward the setting sun, in other words, moving west. Well, one of the many speculations about this stele and monument of Tos speculates that this should be read as stele kai mnema totuos, which, apologize, this is a little off the screen, which basically means the stele and monument of Atys. And Hipponax, writing in the second half of the 5th century, be a near contemporary of Atys, and is definitely referring to a prominent stele as a landmark as he's passing, and perhaps this indentation is correct, he even names it as the stele of Atys, which could be the prototype for this monument. And there is another hint that points in the same direction. If you're familiar with Xenophon's Cyropaideia, this is Xenophon's fictionalized history of the Cyrus the Great, the conqueror of Lydia. When Cyrus describes, when Xenophon describes the battle of Cyrus and Croesus, he praises one of Cyrus's allies, the heroic king of Susa, who dies fighting for Cyrus, and praises his wife as the lady of Susa, said to be the most beautiful woman in Asia. who, after her husband died and Cyrus raised a burial mound, she committed suicide on her husband's grave. And then Xenophon says, to this day, the tumulus still stands with inscribed with letters, the letters in Syrian letters, which could be Aramaic or Lydian, the name of the man and the woman. Now, Xenophon actually spent some time in Sardis. If you're familiar with his Anabasis, he rallied with Cyrus the Younger in Sardis before moving on. And as he says, it claims to his day, still a stele could be seen with the name of the man and the woman. In this case, identifying them as heroic couple that gave their life fighting for Cyrus in this case. But perhaps this is a reference to the tumulus of Atys, which would be the prototype for this. So is this the original home of this type, which, as I suggest, then becomes the standard way of praising and memorializing the heroic dead in Anatolia? These stelae would be elite burial monuments for local princes, members of the satrapy, who identify themselves with the same heroic attributes that are described in the case of Herodotus' story. Furthermore, I would say that Herodotus' story about Atys, which has often been described as kind of a tragic novella that some have even speculated is even invented by Herodotus in order to give color to the tragic fate of Croesus. He tragically loses his son, but very likely this is Herodotus's narration of what he has shown in the form of a stele, where here is a man who marries, here is a man who goes on a hunt, and oh, he died. And it was a great tragedy because he was Croesus's favorite son. And so Herodotus has spun this into a story about the ill fate in store for Croesus. But this funerary type has a long life. So we have these examples, also including the very interesting variation in the Vezir Khan stele in the Istanbul Museum, with its long Phrygian and short Greek inscription, and also an interesting figure at the top of the stele, but also a wedding and a hunt. But this is a scene that is reproduced elsewhere. Also among the Sidon sarcophagi, there is the so-called satrap sarcophagus, which has a scene of a hunt as well as the scene of a wedding banquet, as I would describe it. And perhaps you're familiar with the recent sensational discovery in Mylassa of the so-called Hecatomnos sarcophagus, which also on its long sides has a banquet, a wedding banquet of Hecatomnos, and then a hunt scene on the opposite side. These are the formulas for the honoring of an elite male, but also without such explicit attribution, also honoring his bride as a significant element in this heroizing scene. She represents, as we saw in the relief that I showed, Agatha Tuke, and the deceased male then becomes the latest personification of the god of the underworld, the one who is powerful in this life, can be expected to be powerful in the afterlife and send good things to their descendants, their worshippers. The same scene I show here on a red figure cup shows in its tondo Pluto and his bride Persephone, and on the exterior of that cup shows the wedding of Poseidon and Amphitrite, and other gods and their brides as well. So the formula is definitely a marriage. It definitely refers to, in this context, the fertility of the underworld and the ability of powers in the underworld to send good things to those in this life. So I suggest that this, in origin, an Anatolian heroic archetype, is the ancestor to this long tradition of honoring the dead and remembering them as by their families as those who may have power over this world after their death. Thank you.